So, as expected, House of the Dragon were fairly strong consistency as a very great fantasy series. And of course, it's inevitable. What is the comparison to Rings of Power? I will do that very briefly. Let's get to House of the Dragon proper, and then assess where we're going to go with Rings of Power. So, one of the things I am finding a little annoying, it's not too bad, is they don't still yet have the main antagonist for the season. I mean, the pirates are appropriately ferocious and very formidable. That's fine. But they're not the main antagonist. They're just sort of an interesting distraction. It's a very well done distraction. But we know for the story, they can't be the mo. It seems so far, at least with half the season, it's going to be seeing quote unquote a good Targaryen. We haven't really seen that. He wants to rule wisely, but he's constantly torn with his consciousness. I think they're leaning way too much on that to generate plot contrivances, but that's me. And in terms of Matt Smith, I guess I'm still a little bit more cool than others. I don't hate Matt Smith. I think he's obviously a very talented performer, but I'm not getting why Damon is getting such a boost from the fandom. And I still find linguistically the dialogue is good. It is strong, but it doesn't have the kind of rhythmic or poetic flow that George has in the books, or even, frankly, the early Game of Thrones stuff had. Again, it's apples and oranges, because Benioff and Weiss, good or bad, did have access to that great dialogue, and they could sort of choose to compress it, or even in some cases, I know I'm going to get misquoted and clipped, but even sometimes they improved on the dialogue, but then they had a lot of samples. And here, it's kind of lacking the playfulness I would expect from these kinds of people, because, yes, of course, they're always having a double language. The surface meaning that Otto or Damon or Corliss have, and the underlying double entendre. It just doesn't have that same double punch that George really has. But he is being consulted. Ryan is much more actively consulting with him. But so far, the dialogue still feels to me kind of functional. It's still missing a lot for me, but that's my perspective. I could be wrong. I mean, I think the Rings of Power dialogue is pretty good, and a lot of people clearly think it's the most evil, cringe thing since She-Hulk, which I think is pretty extreme interpretation, but that's me. I'm trying to be generous to both sides. And I want to just deal with this briefly, because I know this is going to become more of a thing, whether playful memes or really vicious attacks with Corliss and the race question. I would just say in the books, as far as I understand it, the real issue is not really Corliss. It's Laenor, the son. And yes, the casting that they did could have been done better, but as long as the children look mixed race, that's the most important thing. So they look fine. The problem, I think, is the wigs. I can't believe this is really the same family. But to be fair, in Game of Thrones, it's the same thing. Did I really believe Peter Dinklage and Nick were brothers? No. Did I really believe Cersei and Jamie were brother and sister as played by the actors? No. Clearly, they don't really look the same. They're from different countries, literally. So it's not the same family. That's not too bad. But I would just say, yeah, in terms of the quote, skin color controversy, it's Laenor that's more important. And we're going to see that hopefully when the narrative moves forward. So, like, he's much more central to the narrative. But again, they're not following the book strictly, so we'll see how that goes. But the children do look mixed race, so that don't be worried too much on that one. That's what really matters. And in terms of my own favorite characters, I'm already guessing which one of the knights they're setting up to be knocked off. I hope I'm wrong, because I really like this character. But again, now that they're not following the books, people who are alive in the books can be killed off. I'm actually hoping what's going to happen is they're killed off maybe for a season, they're just badly injured, and they're going to come back for a future season. But again, it is Game of Thrones, so you don't want to become too attached to the fan favorites. One of the lore things I'm still a little puzzled by is what is Cyrax or Cyrex? Because it seems like there's inconsistency with the naming. So is this a canonical change? Because in the books it's Cyrax, but even some of the videos get this wrong and they're calling him Cyrex. So I'm a little confused. Is that like a canonical change like Asha? I'm honestly asking. So I was getting a little confused how the dragons are being named, called. So, and I'm bringing this up because now comes the Rings of Power parallel. Because yes, we did see some of the dragons for Rings of Power, But if you know the mythology of Tolkien, that's really more the first age. There are still dragons after the first age, but they're very rare, right? Smaug is very, very rare. But now that Rings of Power is here, it will be interesting if they do start unleashing the dragons, including Smaug, right? He can technically make a cameo and not really ruin the mythology, right? He doesn't really break the canon in that way. I wonder what the comparison will be, or the basis of comparison, because as critical as I am of the Lord of the Rings films, they were films, and the technology has changed a lot with the camera. And I do appreciate House of the Dragon has a very kinetic camera, whereas Game of Thrones, the TV show, was fairly static. Even when they moved the camera, they didn't move it that much. It was just very plain action reaction shots. So I do appreciate the directors are being more adventuresome. Even though these are some of the same directors, they clearly have more freedom of movement, and I do appreciate that they're taking advantage of that. But one thing I did like about the Peter Jackson films is they were done in a more classical narrative style, so the camera wasn't whipping around too much. I mean, of course, with the scenes with the orcs, yeah, the camera I think moved in a moronic fashion for no reason, but a lot of times he did stabilize the camera. So I like, I get it. Nightmare of the final seasons of Game of Thrones, just having all this freedom now to do their own thing. They're taking advantage of it, but I would appreciate them slowing down in a few places. And finally, in terms of the larger lore with the Targaryens and now the dreams, I guess I'm not concerned if this is going to contradict what we see in Game of Thrones with quote unquote the dream visions of the Targaryens. I'm just more concerned with the larger world building because the way I understood it, if the dragons come back, the magic comes back. We have a lot of dragons now, so magic should be more plentiful, but we haven't really seen that. So I'm hoping we are going to see a lot more with the witches and the wizards, and hopefully the faceless men will make an appearance. That's the way I understood the system, right? The dragons are going to bring back the magic. We now have a lot of dragons, but magic has so far been limited in terms of what we've seen on screen. So I'm hoping they're going to resolve that kind of world building paradox I have. Overall, fairly strong episode. I would have to give this a much higher grade than Rings of Power because, again, a lot of the narrative is just being set up in that case, but here we're just sort of being dropped into the middle of the action, and it is much more exciting and much more easy to become engaged with it. So I'm giving this a very confident 8.5, and I will go into a more detailed comparison in the spoiler video. Thanks for listening.